As of late, Neigefeu seems to have taken the spotlight in the modern style creating scene, and ever since Akiu has managed to catch my interest despite my lack of engagement in the style overall. Since I only really started paying attention to his creating career relatively recently, I thought it would be interesting to go back in time a bit and see how far he's come since his first rates, decoration wise. Since apparently this wasn't clear in the top 50 video, the reason I'm not going to be judging gameplay is because, while I'm able to beat and evaluate the gameplay of Neigefeu's easier levels, I can't get anywhere near being able to give my opinion on levels as difficult as Rust, which means the gameplay isn't a factor I can judge equally across all his solos. I also can't take a more general approach to assessing the gameplay through the views of other people, because some of Neigefeu's works have received far more attention than others, and will therefore have a much higher number of opinions, again creating some level of unfairness where I can judge one level more effectively and accurately than another. I may still talk about gameplay styles and visual aspects because I don't need to have played the levels to assess them. Anyway, the oldest of Neigefeu's rated levels were some of the easiest to place, and yet paradoxically also some of the most difficult. This is down to a lot of Neigefeu's older work being very inconsistent in the amount of emotion it's able to convey. On the less interesting side of the spectrum, you have something like Energy, which is Neigefeu's most bland work in my opinion. The level feels pretty uninspired, taking on a lot of tropes of average featured levels of the time, like the song that sounds like it could be used in just about any non-demon under the sun, or the classic invisible size portals. The level feels pretty formulaic and samey all the way through, as if Neige was just building this on autopilot, ticking off checkboxes for a basic background, block design, and maybe an extra glow effect to really get the blood pumping. I do like that the colours in some parts foreshadow Neige's future skill in matching excellent primary and secondary colours, and the somewhat minimal glow use also reflects the beginning of his mastery of it. Unfortunately, Neige's next level chronologically actually feels like more of a step back in both of these aspects, which doesn't really help me show any sort of a journey towards the creator he is today. Anyway, deciding what I like more out of Prisma and Energy was pretty difficult, and while I think many would choose the latter over the former for the more consistent style, more aesthetically pleasing colours, and Prisma feeling fairly disjointed in terms of its overall structure, I still chose to put Prisma above because I would simply much rather play Prisma than Energy. As while the former feels like a regress in terms of an overall development in Edge's style, the latter feels like being given life-threatening doses of melatonin by a doctor with a side job as an ASMR YouTuber. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that the way Prisma creates sync in some of the more intense parts makes it feel marginally less bland than Energy, and it's certainly ironic that the song used in Prisma actually carries more energy than the one used in Energy. However, there are still a lot of flaws with Prisma that it would be wrong not to address. The most pressing one for me personally is that there are very few full parts, particularly in this midsection. Due to the way the level attempts to match the song, each part just feels like a transition into the next rather than an actual part. There are definitely ways to pull off this fast switching between parts well, but I feel like the way Neige did it here is kind of lazy, avoiding adding in details because he could get away with it due to the part length. Even the full parts nearer to the end are pretty lacking in detail, with a particular noticeable space left between the background and foreground that Neige only rarely attempts to fill. The first few parts are much better. The colours in this part are extremely saturated, but unlike in this duel, the style isn't quite right for them to work properly. And the next part relies a lot on glow, when you could honestly just strip away a lot of it and the part would look fine. Even the possibility of a subsequent emptiness as a result of getting rid of this glow doesn't matter too much, as is proved in Whist. Admittedly, the lack of detail works far better for the song and overall mood in Whist. It's not like there's much opportunity to fill space using gradients in Prisma, because it would probably result in a lot of tonal dissonance. Even so, Whist is still my preferred level because it manages to match its decoration to the song far more effectively, with good use of slow interlacing backgrounds, simplistic but effective structuring, and even some attempts at lighting in some parts that all work to create a sort of delicate atmosphere. However, there are quite a few things that break the turn a little, like the snappy movement of a few of the backgrounds and some incredibly misjudged use of the shake trigger. There's also a fair few spots where the colours are a significant issue, which is sort of frustrating given there's only about 3 of them on screen at any point. And seeing such weird colour picks like this shade of red against white, which should be very easy to work with, is a bit maddening. It's excusable though, particularly as this was Neigefeu's first rated solo. One thing that really grinds my gears about Whist, and the previous 2 levels as well, is laziness. Whist suffers from the same issue that I noted in Prisma, being that Neigefeu's transitions suffer from a lack of detail. Something that's particularly noticeable when a part doesn't directly cut into a separate transition area, but just continues without any surrounding block design. I don't want to come across as harsh, but this honestly just seems like Neige taking advantage of the lower expectations of transitions in order to build less. It's not a massive issue, but it's one that annoys me specifically because it would have taken barely any time to put down a few extra blocks leading out of the part, to make the level not feel rushed. There's also the problem of length. All 3 of these levels have ended very close to the 1 minute mark, which is again not a huge issue, and I appreciate that none of the levels end particularly abruptly, but it just sort of cheapens the whole experience to know that the length probably wasn't chosen because it allowed the level to end at a place which made sense, but mostly out of reaching an arbitrary length that's most likely going to result in a rate. Fortunately, Soul manages to solve this problem at least somewhat, coming in at over 2 minutes in length. While I still get the nagging feeling that the level might have been stretched out a little to reach this timestamp, given that I think it would have made a lot more sense to end 30 seconds or so earlier, so you don't get blue balled with the possibility of another drop, I suppose it's as good a time to end as any if Nej wanted to avoid making another 2 minutes of this level. Other than that, Sol is a pretty decent level. Although for the most part it carries on using some of the tropes of Nej's earlier levels, like spinning, multi-layer backgrounds, white outline structures, and maybe some slightly trippy saws, some parts do try to mix it up a bit, a noticeable example being this ball. The element variations that it does share with some of his earlier works are generally improved on as well, and as a result, Sol often feels a lot more clean than its predecessors. The main problem I have with Sol is that despite its ambition, all its new ideas are executed a bit half-heartedly. Oh, look at that fancy new effect. I'm glad Neigefeu's mixing it up a bit in terms of backgrounds. Shame doesn't cover the whole screen and the movements don't really work with how calm the song is. Hey, look at those cool sparkling stars in the transitions at the drop. Unfortunate that they don't cover up the very noticeable lack of blocks as you come out of the part. Man, it's really interesting to see Nej try and sync up the song with colorwork and pulses. Kinda disappointing that the massive glow shades on the sides of the screen make the part so saturated and blinding. Despite my disappointment at the way all these new ideas were implemented, it still feels like a big step up from something like Prisma or Energy, and some of the glow work in particular is a notable point along the path of Neigefeu's mastery of it. This is also the case for Air, which is another step up from Neig's more bland levels. However, in this level, I think it's more the effects and backgrounds that stand out to me more than the color or glow work. In fact, I think the colors and glow are some of the worst aspects of Air, which is really a shame because the effects here are some of the best Nej has ever made. My favourite by far has to be this one, which seems to be imitating glass refraction and does so wonderfully. The next one, opening up the background into space, also makes some really impressive use of masking, as well as just being a really cool concept. It's disappointing then that the colours drag down the level a lot for me. Every part seems to suffer from a different colour issue that makes any interesting effects present seem pretty out of place. For example, this sort of transition part is very monochrome, while the drop lacks proper implementation of a gradient and so for the most part feels pretty flat. The designs here are also some of the poorest quality in Neig's catalogue, particularly in the first part, which is full of these blocks with basically nothing in except some random details. Air is also plagued with these fading slopes, which creates a sort of impermanence which makes even the cleanest parts seem pretty messy. There's only one positive I have for these blocks, which is that you can see them fade slower or faster as this whole part moves, but other than that they really don't work well at all with the style. It's pretty disappointing that this is the level that we got after Neig's experimentation with other styles and concepts, particularly given Neig was a lot more experienced in this style than with something like a minigame. To be fair, Nej had tried at least one minigame before Somnu, but it was pretty lacking in terms of presentation and difficulty balancing, as well as playtesting to make sure it actually worked properly. Somnu, on the other hand, works much better in all these areas. There's certainly a build-up in difficulty over the level's duration, but it scales pretty well with the player getting used to the mechanics. Speaking of, there's only 2 gameplay variations present in Somnu, but since the level doesn't last for too long and the song doesn't dramatically change at any point, you're not left wanting more. The presentation of this level tying in with the gameplay is really the only problem I have with Somnu. Although I said that the difficulty scales well, the fact that most of the obstacles use similar colours to and pulse in sync with the background means that the gameplay can feel a little confusing near the end. It's also quite baffling that instead of making the line obstacles something that sticks out like bright red strips, Nej instead chose to make them glow lines, with hue and saturation shifts that don't really prevent them from blending into everything around them. It's even worse with the saws, which are just the exact shade of the background. Admittedly, the exclamation marks are pretty helpful, but it's solving a problem that didn't need to be created in the first place. And the use of contrast on the markers and the character, for that matter, show that this could have easily been applied to other gameplay objects. Speaking of, the character is actually one of my favourite parts of this level. The animations are all surprisingly smooth, even when the pace picks up, and I love the details like the blinking at the start and the headbanging when the drop hits. It's a really simple design, but it works very well, especially since the player is very used to seeing cubes avoiding obstacles. There's also a noticeable focus on syncing with every part of the song, in more precise ways like the wavy dots at the bottom, or more abstract like the big moving backgrounds, which have the same level of simplicity as some of Neig's earlier backgrounds, but for some reason work a lot better in syncing to the music. I think both this and Intro were excellent ways for Neig to go out of his comfort zone, because they both helped enormously in developing his style in his regular levels. Intro particularly gave Neig a challenge in that it forced him to focus on his color work and backgrounds in order to create sync, along with the innate challenge of making a level with no gameplay interesting enough to sit through. I think Neig excelled in both of these areas, particularly by making every part feel different but also tying them together with a similar style of masked backgrounds and bright flashy colours. The colours are actually the main thing that engaged me with Intra, which I'm sure is something that Neige noted as well given their future focus on excellent colour work. There's only one part which I feel suffers colour-wise, simply because it's entirely monochrome and caked in glow. Speaking of, you can clearly see that there's been a huge improvement in the way Neige uses glow at this point. A good number of parts use no glow or very sparing amounts of it, and when it is used, it seems like Neige put some real thought into it, in order to build on top of what's already present to create even more engagement. This is something that it holds over Stigma, wherein the first few parts suffer from the incredibly bright glow that could have been toned down a lot more to create the colour work that Neige was attempting. This links into another big problem I have with Stigma, which is that it creates intensity at a lot of the wrong points. The incredibly violent pulses in the robot contrasting against the pretty calm nature of the song here are the most notable examples of this. Stuff like the screen flashes not only feel like rubbing acid-soaked sandpaper on my eyes, but also detract from the tension later in the level, which is where it's actually meant to be. That's not to say that the intensity within the boss fight section isn't really well done. The stiff movements of the mechanical dragon thing work surprisingly well, although I think the decreasing number of attacks in the last half kind of detracts from the build up a little. The actual attacks feel frantic and intimidating enough to mostly resolve this. The slightly ambiguous boss death is a bit weird, but basically every boss fight level does this anyway, so it's not like it's a complaint that's unique to Stigma, and at the very least is an attempt to make it feel like you're fighting back against it. A problem that does seem unique to Stigma is the style mixing, which is expected from a level like this from a creator who's only really built modern stuff, but still detracts from the atmosphere in certain parts. This is easily spotted in the boss fight, where the classic bright spinning modern backgrounds don't work at all well with the dark tension that's created in this section. To be fair, I don't think a lot of people will notice it, as the boss is clearly the centerpiece, but once I spotted it, it was difficult not to notice when aspects of modern design were bleeding into other parts. In some ways then, it feels good to return to a much purer modern style for the next level. Despite its simplicity, Past is an absolute masterclass in color management, with almost every part containing some new interesting way to approach it. Neigefeu isn't scared to rely on it either. I have no doubt that most of the time spent decorating was focused on perfecting the colours, because he knew that they would be able to carry the simple designs. It was also a very risky decision for Neige to challenge himself to build such a long level within the time limit, and I find it brilliant that he managed to make every part stand out despite this restriction. What I don't like about Past, and the reason why it's not really at the top of this list, is because it feels a bit thematically incoherent, and therefore I feel like the sense of completing a journey you get at the end isn't really earned, but more forced into your mind by the length of the level. When you actually go back and look at the different parts, there's no real progression or meaning for any of the parts being in the places that they are. Music sync aside, I really think you could swap these parts around in any order and you wouldn't lose much at all in terms of a narrative. Seeing something related to a day and night progression would have been really interesting, as aspects of that theme are already present in a few parts. The first and last part also contrast pretty well, with the latter being very grounded and dark, while the first feels like an exploration of the sky, showing that there was also potential for some progression there. Maybe I'm expecting a bit too much from a level built in a week, but honestly I don't think it would have been too much extra effort to plan it out a bit more so that it feels like a coherent journey. This is also a problem I have with Ambu, but to a lesser extent, as that kind of theming is only really obviously presented in one part, and because there were no time constraints, the part doesn't have to rely on it. One thing that's much better in Past than Ambu is the colours. This level feels similar to Aya in that it has some amazing effects and ideas, but because of the colours they fall a little flat. However, this isn't nearly as much of a problem as it is in Aya, because even the worst parts colour-wise never feel flat or monochrome like a good number of parts in Aya. The other aspects of the parts also usually make up for it. Glow use is still a bit on the spammy side in some parts, but the structuring and outlining is amazing throughout. In Ambu, Neigefeu finally takes advantage of the relative ease with which you can create more unconventional structures in the style and runs with it, resulting in some incredibly unique designs which often make great use of curves and angles that wouldn't be feasible in other styles. Neige also makes this work with a lot of the backgrounds and effects, something that's most notable in the last ship, which features probably the smoothest wave animations I've seen to date. Actually, that might be a lie, considering Aku also has some incredibly smooth moving backgrounds. I honestly think the backgrounds in Aku are a bit underappreciated. The movements in all of them, particularly the oval at the drop and the line at the end, are synced perfectly to every note, but not just opening and closing on the same easing every time like you would expect. They jerk and vibrate and pulse and shift so smoothly to reflect individual quirks in the song that it almost feels like an auto-generated visualizer, which just goes to show how much work was put into even the smallest dynamic details of this level. This also applies to the colours, and while the level is rushing past you, it might be difficult to spot why. But one thing that really shows how much time was put into shifting the colours precisely in tone with the song is just looking at some of the blocks in Editor or this colour palette at the start while playing the song. The fact that Neige even thought to lay out a colour palette in the first place alone should show you how much emphasis was put on colour management. Unfortunately, this does mean that the designs fall a little by the wayside. The entire drop and post-drop is made up of these overlapping dark and coloured slabs, and while it's a decent design, I think it gets a lot more use than it deserves, especially considering how large the blocks are and how simple the design is. As a consequence of their overuse, I feel like the first two parts also feel a bit disconnected from the rest, particularly the first part, which uses almost no black to contrast the brighter blocks, although I do like that it keeps the idea of brightly coloured blocks interlacing with the darker ones. I think Aki would have worked a lot better if it had managed its block design progression a bit more like Veil, which starts off very simply and then slowly builds up in complexity until a return back to simplicity at the very end. Although it doesn't exactly reach dizzying levels of complexity, it works well enough with the additional colour progression to create a sense of a journey, arguably more effectively than Past. Veil actually has quite a few similarities to Past now I think about it. The designs are very simple and there's nothing particularly interesting about the structuring, but once again a lot of thought was put into making sure the colours could carry it. I think some of the ideas, like the completely flat flashes in the second part, don't work nearly as well as some others, and overall I'd say it's worse at pulling off its base in colour than Past. Of course, that's a really high bar to cross, and just because I find Veil's colours to be worse than Past, that doesn't mean they're bad or anything close to that. One thing that Veil doesn't share with Past is its gameplay structure. Veil's obvious main gimmick is that it uses the follow player trigger in a really unique way to create timings for its single game mode. The gameplay being another big focus again makes the simplicity of the designs a much easier pill to swallow, especially when it's executed as smoothly as this. I love how free and light the ball feels in comparison to how linear it often seems in other levels, and the increased use of slopes near the end really helps to emphasize this and make Veil stand out gameplay wise. Although you could very easily make the case that this isn't the Neigefeu level most known for its unique gameplay. I wouldn't blame you if you thought Rust would be my top pick honestly, considering I've talked about it before and shown obvious love for fully solo levels in the past. Honestly, my main issue with Rust is not particularly even to do with the level, but with me becoming fairly disinterested in this style of gameplay. I have no doubt that Rust is very fun, but regardless the way this gameplay looks is not really appealing to me anymore. I have absolutely zero doubt that this is at least in part caused by my first-hand experience of what happens when this style of gameplay goes wrong, which is a real shame. Gameplay like this is so often fascinating to me, and the use of pattern breaking, momentum and creative orb placement in Rust is some of the best I've ever seen, and I'm sure if I had not had such a bad experience with the reaction to using this sort of gameplay myself, I would like it a lot more. The other things I dislike about Rust are kind of nitpicky and not worth spending much time on. The main ones being that I find the ending of the level to be very unsatisfying, and I think the unoriginality of the song choice results in the level sticking out a lot less than it might otherwise. Despite that, one of Rust's absolute best aspects is the way it matches to the song and the general theming. As the name would imply, there's a lot of focus around machinery, which is an odd choice for a modern style, but one that Neige pulls off fantastically for the most part. This isn't just as a result of the actual objects used, but also in something that you rarely ever see being used in levels today despite their clear potential: screen boundaries. The use of black glow to restrict your vision is some of the most creative visual sync I've ever seen, and it's done so well that you might not even consciously register it the first time it happens. Obviously, the color work in Rust is also great, in my opinion being the best we've seen from Neige. The level feels dusty and grimy and incredibly intense when it needs to, making good use of hue and saturation contrast to carry the fairly static and simple designs, but calming down to match the song when it's required. I'd also like to quickly touch on the movements, because they're also one of the best parts of the level in terms of setting the tone. Every movement in Rust feels stiff and janky, as if each object is grinding past each other, which is a fantastic choice given the way the song feels at its most intense parts. Movements alongside color work is one of the best markers to track Neige's growth along his creating career, and the fact that he's paying attention to it even in his simpler levels like a stroll shows that he's considering movements much more like a tool to create an atmosphere than he was 3 years ago. A stroll forms a great point of comparison against Whist, Neige's first rated solo, in that it feels like everything Whist wanted to be, with a consistent, charming simplicity that creates a peaceful, calm and comforting atmosphere that's matched perfectly by the level's theming and concept. The only other level I can think of that manages to pull off such incredibly simplistic theming that's still effective is No Cure. Although the difference in recent creating experience between Neige and Junkie results in the stroll being perhaps the more developed of the two, even though I love No Cure's focus on thematic efficiency. Tangents aside, it's the little things that make a stroll work so well for me, both in a macro and micro sense. The desaturated outlines, the jerky and smooth movement contrast, the restricted vision, the custom spikes, mini mode, and little clusters of small single color blocks all work together to make the level feel crisp and clean, and above all very delicate. Despite its length, there's still a good few details that you probably won't notice on your first playthrough. My particular favourite being the colours in the first part creating a day-night cycle, which carries through perfectly into the dark transition to the ball. I just want to grab the Neige from 3 years ago and say, look, this is how you do transitions. The sudden lack of block designs actually works here, and because of the sync to the music and the fact that the jittery and sudden movements have already been set up early in the part, it doesn't feel at all out of place. It's honestly quite a genius way of setting up the next part, and so it's a shame that I don't really like the ball as much as the robot. The structures are a lot larger here, meaning that the lack of detail within them is much more noticeable. And in general, I feel like the ball is lacking in a lot of the interesting details that the first part had. There are still a few little things to spot, like the colours of the small squares inverting saturation when they cross over into the blocks, but I was left unsatisfied by the lack of a similar detail to the day-night cycle in the first part. One thing that I feel pretty pedantic for pointing out is the blue pads here, being the only visible gameplay objects in the whole level, but it's something that kind of draws me out of the part, as it makes it seem less like you're exploring an environment and more like you're just progressing through set gameplay, which is again undermined by you just being able to skip the pads entirely. Despite its flaws, a stroll still ended up being my favourite Neigefeu level to date, which is honestly a surprise to me considering its simplicity and the fact that it's much less well known than some of Neigefeu's other levels. I think the way it contrasts with Whist is honestly really effective in showing Neig's growth as a creator. From making simplism seem more like a tool for building less than would normally be required, to a way to create tonal depth with as few objects as possible. A stroll, along with Rust and a few more of Neig's most recent projects, also show Neig's movement away from common creating standards and towards just building whatever he wants, which has actually resulted in some of his best work yet. You might be wondering, considering that I clearly care about Neig's levels enough to make a whole video analysing them, why none of his levels are in my favourite levels playlist. This is because I still feel like he hasn't combined the best aspects of his best levels to make something that really blows me away. As I've shown, even a stroll, my favourite level of his, has some pretty pressing flaws in my eyes, and I'm waiting for the day when something finally surpasses it. In saying this, I'm not trying to impose any sort of creating restrictions on Neig, nor do I think there would be much point in trying. I just hope that at some point in the future, the two lines of what I enjoy seeing and what he enjoys making can finally meet.